that your line is in the question queue. You may press star 2 if you would like to remove your question from the queue. For participants using speaker equipment, it may be necessary to pick up your handset before pressing the star keys. One moment, please, while we poll for questions. Thank you. Our first question is coming from Mark Goodman with SVB Leerink. Please proceed.
Hi, this is Roanna on the line for Mark. So I was curious, could you maybe qualitatively talk a bit about the dynamic we might see with Epidiolex transitioning from first quarter to second quarter? I know you mentioned seasonality effects, but I'm wondering if that could sort of be made back up in second quarter.
Hi, it's Darren. Thanks for the question. No, I think, in Q1 you'll see these seasonality things, but as we've stated, 2020 there's several drivers of the business that we think will propel us into 2020. Epidiolex clinical performance. We still look to opportunity we have within LGS and Dravet, and as we've spoken about, the TSC approval in the latter half of 2020. I think sets us up for a really nice 2020.
Okay, got it. And one more question, if I may. Could you remind us what the split is in patients for Epidiolex between children and adults, and if that still looks like it's upticking in the last quarter?
Stayed still at 60-40.
Okay, great. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Our next question is coming from David Lebowitz with Morgan Stanley. Please proceed.
Thank you very much for taking my question. Could you run us through the process that a payer goes through in determining when to move to open access, and I guess what the trajectory was like to get to the initial 15% that you have at this point, and how you expect it might evolve as you move through 2020?
Yeah, thanks for the question. As we've said, we were very pleased with the coverage we had in the first year with Epidiolex. And it sets a great foundation for us in 2020 and beyond. We're in those discussions now with the payers regarding their current utilization and their policies. And consistent with our previous remarks at AES and JP Morgan, we do expect to see real progress in 2020. But these discussions require some time, and I expect progress to be steady during the course of this year. It remains our goal to see more open access, much like ESI, which we had out of the gate, and I see it as very realistic for us.
Thanks for taking my question.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Tazeen Ahmad with Bank of America. Please proceed.
Okay, I think that's me. So, hi guys. Just wanted to ask if you can give us some color about how to think about the cadence of the launch in the European countries. We understand that it's going to be staggered throughout the course of the year, but for modeling purposes, how should we think about comparing, I guess, the trajectory of that launch versus what you saw in the U.S., and I guess when you might be in a position where you would be able to break out going forward U.S. and ex-U.S. sales? Thanks.
Thanks, Tazeen. I'll let Justin Scott answer the second part of the question. I think everybody's aware that the European launch is very, very different to a U.S. launch. I think we were obviously the drug was approved late in September, and the first country to get approval where we have genuinely commercial launch ongoing is Germany, and then the end of January, following NICE and reimbursement being put in place for the UK, a late January launch for the UK. So, two markets started, but 3 months apart. France, we still don't have a full commercial launch. Spain and Italy, we talk about reimbursement in the second half of the year. So we would hope that we would have all 5 countries up by the end of the year, Tazeen, with reimbursement and a good price. So it's really going to be a much slower cadence in Europe, and it will be bitty because it'll be one country coming on at a time as we go through this year.
Thanks, Chris. And Tazeen, for your last point, I mean, I think we do definitely see the Epidiolex as a single global brand, which is kind of why we headlined it in this way. Darren did mention, and you'll see in the K that we're filing a geographic split out. So the Q4 at U.S. revenue was just over 100 million, and so there is. We are able in this quarter at least to show you what the ex-US revenue was.
And do you expect that to continue?
Something we're looking at.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Corey Kasimov with J.P. Morgan. Please proceed.
Hey, good afternoon, guys. Thank you for taking my question. Wanted to see if you could talk more about how you see the IP positioning for Epidiolex. I think a lot of people simply assume you get your orphan exclusivity, but don't really give you credit for the patents out to 2035 and even potentially beyond. So can you just remind us of the significance of those patents and your level of confidence as to whether they can confer protection for the product that far into the future? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. And it clearly recognized as an area of ongoing sort of debate, but we start in unusual position because of the lack of any protection here. But I think appreciate the opportunity to reinforce the fact that the strategy that we've adopted here is one that was started many years ago, has led to a wealth of filings and granted patents that really are designed very specifically to match the key features of the label. 9 already in place, 2 new allowed patents, 2 coming for TSC, more on their way. So you will see even over the next couple of years some more additional patents into the Orange Book with this 2035 timeline. I think on top of that, we briefly alluded towards the end of last year about a new composition-like patent, which is going through prosecution right now. It's a different approach, complements very much the use IP, but were that to grant and were that to emerge the way we hope, really puts us in a very different position as it relates to protection beyond use and more directly to the product itself. So, I appreciate there's a journey to go through here, but I'm very comfortable saying that investors should recognize there's a lot of work that's gone on already, a lot of investment going on, and more to come. In addition, of course, with formulations as well. So, I think this is a story that is it really hasn't yet begun and will play out over many years.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate the thoughtful answer.
Thank you. Our next question is coming from the line of Phil Nadeau with Cowen and Company. Please proceed with your question.
Good afternoon. Congrats on the progress. A couple questions on the TSC market. You mentioned that is likely to be a growth driver in 2020, particularly once the label is expanded to include TSC. Can you give us some sense of what penetration you have of TSC patients today and whether Epidiolex is being used in some patients who predominantly have focal seizures?
Hey, Phil, it's Darren. So regarding current utilization, we think it's very minimal. As you recall, we had the top-line results press release in 2019. The data were presented for the first time at AES in December. And so, that data has not been disseminated, as you alluded to. We don't promote to it because it's not on our label just yet. But when we look at where TSC is being treated, most of these patients are across 40 or so institutions in the U.S. There is some overlap with our current treating physician base. So, upon the label expansion and the launch of this, as we alluded to in our remarks, our preparation's well underway. We know where our targets are. We anticipate, getting out of the gates pretty swiftly to communicate this data to them.
And what is your current understanding of the average dose that's used, and how do you think that could change, assuming you get the higher doses on the label with the TSC label expansion?
Yeah, we don't disclose the exact dose, but we have said over the last 12 months it's been creeping up towards the middle of that dose range, Phil. So that's the kind of the guidance we give there. As it relates to TSC, obviously the label is likely to include reference to the 25 milligram per kilogram, so there may well be some effect on the average dose at that point in time. Obviously, have a much better idea when we see the label.
Perfect. Thanks for taking my questions.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Paul Matteis with Stifel. Please proceed.
Hi, this is Alex on for Paul. Just one question here. So you mentioned that you're still less than about 50% penetrated in LGS and Dravet, and just wondering, how much of that you think you can close the gap on with payer access that you're kind of improving this year, and what else do you think you can do to close that? Thanks.
It's Darren. I'll take it. I think closing the gap when we think about, well, first of all, the LGS Dravet, on-label reimbursement is very good. Again, which sets a strong foundation for us moving forward. When we think about market penetration, it's the available patients within the U.S. that are diagnosed with Dravet and LGS that are currently on Epidiolex or have seen Epidiolex. So we feel confident that there's plenty of growth available there within that labeled population. And then as we've talked about the TSC label expansion in the second half of the year.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. The next question comes from Salveen Richter with Goldman Sachs. Please proceed with your question.
Hey, thanks for taking the question. This is Ross on for Salveen. Can you guys just highlight and talk a little bit more about the long-term care segment? What does the patient numbers here look like? How big is this opportunity? And then some of the barriers that, are likely to exist to penetrate this market.
Yeah, that's Darren. Thanks for the question. So the long-term care segment, which encompasses group homes, facilities that, obviously patients cannot care for themselves. We think there's about 300,000 beds in the United States. And we think about a quarter to a third of the patients have some form of seizure. And so there's a tremendous opportunity there. We've looked at analogs, other AEDs within the class, and other of our peer groups that have worked within the long-term care facilities. So, we think our approach with a small dedicated team to work within the buying groups, educating the pharmacist, complement our neurology account management team who are currently calling on physicians to generate the demand. So we think in 2020 it's a nice opportunity for us.
Great. And then I guess just lastly here, if you can talk to, any changes in the discontinuation rates or patterns you're seeing in the U.S., if these rates have gone, are still consistent with what you're seeing in the clinical trials.
Yeah, still consistent. Persistence is, we think become a strength of the brand.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Charles Duncan with Cantor Fitzgerald. Please proceed with your question.
Hi, this is Maria on for Charles. Thank you for taking my questions and congratulations on a great year. My question has to do with the ongoing phase 3 Rett study that you launched in May of 2019. Could you maybe provide some more color on how enrollment is going and when you expect to complete the enrollment? And also if you have any insight into expected timing of near-term readouts or if and when you plan to present baseline data for the study. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the question. I mean, we don't generally update on ongoing studies in terms of enrollment. I mean, this is not a study expected to report out in 2020. So I think we'll just have a much better view later this year as to and be able to give you more precise guidance. But it's not a 2020 item.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Esther Rajavelu with Oppenheimer & Company. Please proceed with your question.
Hey, guys. Thanks. So in terms of the label expansion for TSC, you're doing a lot of legwork right now to expand access, and I'm kind of wondering what happens, whether you can leverage that work when your label expands to TSC, or would you have to sort of renegotiate the contracts at that point?
It's Darren. Thanks for the question. We The TSC, in our discussions with payers, we talk about LGS Dravet, but also payers want to know what's next. So we're starting to discuss what those data look like. And I think when the payers are now, as I alluded to in my remarks, evaluating their utilization data, they'll take this into account. But I go back to, the value proposition we have for LGS and Dravet is, we believe, strengthened by the addition of TSC in the label.
Gotcha. And then in the composition patent that you've recently submitted, when do you anticipate a decision on the patent?
Well, we'll go through prosecution for this year, so it'll either be towards the end of this year or early next.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Yatin Suneja with Guggenheim Partners. Please proceed with your question.
Hey guys, thank you for taking my questions and congrats on a good quarter. Just on the Q1 comment that you made, I think you said the performance should be consistent. So just trying to understand some of the pushes and pull in Q1. You don't expect a down quarter, right? And then in terms of channel inventory dynamics, anything in 4Q or Q1 that we need to keep an eye on?
Thanks for the question. I'll take the first part and let Scott talk about the second. Regarding this Q1, we really don't have a good comparator to last year, as I stated, because it was the first full launch year in 2019. But much like our peer companies, we're seeing, resetting of deductibles, co-pays, insurance, and those types of things that, of other folks experience. But of course, we plan for those things in Q1. And we have a good team to minimize the impact, but the issue remains for us, as it does for everyone else, and we continue to work through it.
And then, Yatin, it's Scott. I'll take the second part of the question on inventory. There are no inventory dynamics that would be impacting the quarter. I mean, one thing I would remind everyone is that Epidiolex is a scheduled drug, and for that reason, the ability for there to be much inventory in channel is very limited. So the quarter-to-quarter dynamics from an inventory perspective are not significant.
Okay, and then just quickly one more question. Could you maybe give us a sense where you ended 2019 on the average price and what sort of estimate you have on the average price that as you end 2020? Thank you.
Yeah, when we launched, this is Justin Yatin. When we launched, we stated that we expected by the end of the first year to be around an average of gross of 32,500 per patient. When looked at across the patient population, I think we ended up really pretty close to that actually. So I think our assumptions ended up being correct. And so as we move into this year, we've taken a modest price increase, but of course, the net effect of that is less than the actual increase itself. So there's no material shift in terms of how we expect the average price to pan out in 2020.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next question is from Douglas Tsao with H.C. Wainwright. Please proceed with your question.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for the question. Just if you could provide some perspective on the current access for focal onset seizures, and how do you expect that will change with the approval for TSC later this year?
Hi, it's Darren. I'll take the question. While focal is a predominant seizure type within TSC, I think that's how you have to view it. Physicians will diagnose TSC, which is a very specific diagnosis, and focal seizures being the primary one. And so that's how we look at it. But again, something that won't be promoting till, we have that label expansion in the latter half of 2020.
Yeah, but the product is not indicated in the broad adult focal onset seizure market, and nor are we expecting that to be a driver of utilization. It's not within our indication, so it's a different part of the market.
And just so as a follow-up, would you expect the reimbursement will remain limited for focal onset seizures focused on associated with TSC?
I think once we have that label expansion, I think they'll look at the phase 3 data and evaluate utilization based on how I described how focal is a part of the primary seizure type within TS.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is from Danielle Brill with Piper Sandler. Please proceed.
Hi, guys. Thanks for the questions. I guess as a follow-up to that last one, are you seeing any reimbursement, off-label reimbursement for focal seizure types? Generally, what types of seizures are being reimbursed? And then I have a quick follow-up.
I think we're struggling, Danielle, it's Justin here, with the kind of, if the question is about like treatment refractory patients that beyond Dravet and LGS, for which have been through multiple AEDs, etc., highly refractory, then as Darren said, we have experience of those scripts getting through, and if access widens, then more of those scripts would go through. I think we're just trying to make sure that this is, Epidiolex is not an adult focal seizure drug in the way of Keppra and other drugs. So just trying to make sure that we're not straying into that territory when answering this question. But when we think about access and how physicians are prescribing this medication and wanting to use it, is very much within the treatment-resistant setting. And some of those patients may well have focal seizures, of course.
I see. Okay, thanks for clarifying. And then in 4Q, did you have the same run rate as you quoted last quarter? I think you said about 3,000 new patient adds. And do you expect this rate to continue in the U.S. moving forward?
Yeah, so we've, as you know, and everyone is aware, we've kind of that metric is something that is not something we're using in 2020. It was very much just for the launch. So qualitatively, there were no material sort of changes in pattern in the sort of patterns that we saw in Q4 versus Q3.
Got it. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you. Our next question is from David Kideckel with AltaCorp Capital. Please proceed with your question.
Hi, good evening. Congrats on the quarter, and thanks for taking my question. I have a couple of them. The first is more around your nabiximols and Sativex program with your phase 3 in the U.S. in particular. Now, given that there's been, I guess, relatively little revenue contribution across Europe with Sativex in particular, how should we be thinking about Sativex in the U.S.? Do you expect this? Is it more of a potential label expansion, or within spasticity due to MS? Is this something that you feel will be fundamentally different in the U.S. as opposed to Europe?
Yeah, hi, David, it's Darren. Thanks for the question. I think when we look at nabiximols in the U.S., the opportunity initially will be in the MS spasticity, and as we've spoken to at J.P. Morgan. The spasticity in the larger context, there are quite a few other diseases, like spinal cord injury. So those are the initial areas. And I think when you look at market research and patients currently with MS spasticity and how they currently self-medicate with cannabis-based products, there is the time is right. Both physicians and patients both would like an FDA-approved therapy to treat their spasticity.
Okay,
I think, David, just to add color from a kind of ex-US perspective, going into the present day, when that product was launched a decade ago, it was a very different world. We were overcoming a lot of sort of societal hurdles. Symptomatic relief was generally not something that's been a focus in Europe for payers. And I think this is truly a new and very different opportunity from the U.S. market compared with a decade ago in Europe, which was a very different world actually at that point.
Okay, that's very good and encouraging to hear. Thanks for that color, Darren and Justin. My last question just has to go, just going back to your long-term care segment with Epidiolex in particular. How do we view this, I guess, as far as payer reimbursement here? Is this more of a refractory type epilepsy? And what are the sort of timelines you expect with reimbursement on this patient segment?
Hey, David, it's Darren. I think, when you look, I would view the long-term care segment around who the payer is for some of the patients, and it's predominantly Medicaid and Medicare, where depending on the state for Medicaid will depend on that, what that Epidiolex policy is, which is currently in place, as well as Medicare plans. So I think we're well positioned regardless of the payer throughout the U.S. For us, the primary objective is identifying patients within these settings and then generating demand. And we think that the payer landscape supports that.
Okay, thanks very much, and congrats on the quarter.
Thank you. Our next question is from Serge Belanger with Needham & Company. Please proceed.
Hi, thanks for taking my questions. Just one for Scott related to the OpEx guidance. Just wanted to see if you can give us additional color maybe on the progression and the split between R&D and SG&A. And I think you also mentioned there was $30 to $40 million for manufacturing expansion. Where are we in this manufacturing expansion process? And is this the last year of we'll see this expense on as part of OpEx?
So let me take the first question. On the split between SG&A and R&D, I think the split you would see in the financials would be a good starting point, a reasonable split. You would expect R&D as a percentage to tick up a little bit compared to that, but I think that would at least be a good starting point. I think the second question, we continue to make investments in our manufacturing facilities, and so I wouldn't say that this is the last year, but it would probably continue into 2021, and then beyond that, hard to say depending on how the business evolves.
Thanks.
Thank you. We have reached the end of our question and answer session, so I'd like to pass the floor back over to management for any additional concluding comments.
Great. Thank you very much for your time today, and we look forward to updating you on progress with our Q1 results later in the year. So thank you very much for your time, and good evening, good afternoon.
Ladies and gentlemen,